Hello, once again, everybody. I'm Minister James Moss, and we are in our continuing education series. We're in the book of Galatians, or the epistle of Galatians, from Paul to the church of Galatia. All right, so we're starting chapter 2 now. All right, so we're going to we're pushing along. We're learning some things. This particular video or lesson is entitled "The Apostles Accept Paul." Okay, and we're going to cover verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2. All right, here we go. To defend himself against the Judaizers' charges, the apostle pointed to his 14 years of independent ministry between his first 2 visits to Jerusalem following his conversion. He functioned directly under Jesus' authority during that time, and not under the official body at Jerusalem. He helped the Galatians understand the complex relationship existing between himself and the apostles in Jerusalem. So when Paul wrote about his visit to the mother church, he showed both his independence from the other apostles' authority and his respect for them. Paul gave 4 significant aspects of his visit that established his credentials. 1, the companions on his journey. 2, the content of his message. 3, the confirmation of his ministry. And 4, the commission to come to Jerusalem. All right, so we're going into our scriptures real quick, and we're going to bounce back. All right, okay, so here we go. Starting chapter 2. Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren unawares who came in privately to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But of these who seemed to be somewhat whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepteth no man's person, for they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. Okay. It's just something about sometimes, I prefer the King James, but sometimes the way that it's worded is twisted into the way that we normally communicate. So I apologize for the stumbling there and having to get back on track type of thing. Okay. All right, so here we go. Starting at verse 1, chapter 2. Paul continued the itinerary from chapter 1, verse 21, and explained that he went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. Afterward, he went back to Jerusalem. The book of Acts records 5 visits to Jerusalem by Paul. 1, the visit to get acquainted with Peter. 2, the visit to deliver a gift to the Jerusalem church for famine relief. 3, the visit to attend the Jerusalem council. 4, the visit at the end of the second missionary journey. And 5, the visit that resulted in his being imprisoned and sent to Rome. The visit to Jerusalem mentioned here is most likely the second visit, when he delivered the famine relief gift to the Jerusalem church. It would not be the third visit, because Paul spends time in his letter dealing with questions that the Jerusalem council ultimately settled, so the council could not have yet taken place. The 14 years are probably dated not from the last mention of his not from the last mention in his itinerary, but rather from his conversion. The first and 14th years were partial years. Like history itself, Paul intended to divide and orient his life around the time before Christ and after Christ. Paul was converted around AD 32, dating this visit at AD 44-45. Paul was pointing out that he had been preaching to the gospel, preaching to the Gentiles the gospel for a long time, and thus had a specific message that could be discussed with the church leaders in Jerusalem. Following this visit, Paul then took the first missionary journey, wrote this letter to the Galatians in response to the troubling news of spiritual desertion by the new believers, and later attended the Jerusalem council that settled many of the issues discussed in this letter to the Galatians. According to the book of Acts, Barnabas recognized Paul's sincerity as a truly converted former persecutor and introduced Paul to the disciples. Many believers, even the apostles themselves, may have feared that Paul simply was acting in some extravagant ruse in order to find out and capture more Christians. But Barnabas was not afraid, and Paul knew firsthand. Let me back up. I jumped down too far. But Barnabas was not afraid. His name means son of encouragement, and Paul knew firsthand about Barnabas' kind encouragement. Barnabas accompanied Paul on the famine relief visit from Jerusalem to Jerusalem, and traveled with him on the first missionary journey, during which Galatia was evangelized. Thus, Barnabas was well known to the Galatian Christians to whom Paul was writing. Titus, a Greek, was one of Paul's most trusted and dependable co-workers. Paul called him a true child in the faith, so he was probably one of Paul's converts. This trip to Jerusalem with Paul became the first of many journeys for Titus, who would later become a true right-hand man to the Apostle Paul. Exactly why Paul brought Titus along to Jerusalem is unclear. Possibly because Titus was a pure Gentile convert, he was presented as a test case to the church leaders. Verse 2, God told Paul through a revelation to confer with the church leaders in Jerusalem so they would understand the message he had been preaching to the Gentiles. Paul's point here was that his visit to Jerusalem was not because the apostles had summoned him or because he had felt a need to talk to the apostles about his ministry among the Gentiles. This revelation may have been to Paul personally, or it may have come through someone else. It is probable that Paul was referring to the prophecy made by Agabus, who had predicted that a severe famine was coming, for we are told that his prophecy led to Paul and Barnabas being sent to Jerusalem, and Paul using that God-given opportunity to talk to the church leaders. Remember that one reason Paul wrote this letter was to combat the false teaching of the Judaizers who were trying to undermine Paul's authority as an apostle. Paul did not go to Jerusalem at the call of the apostles, and he did not go to get approval for the gospel he preached. Instead, Paul went to set his message before them to make sure they did not disagree. Paul didn't need approval because the gospel had been revealed to him by God himself. The essence of the gospel Paul preached to both Jews and Gentiles was that God's salvation is offered to all people regardless of race, sex, nationality, wealth, social standing, educational level, or anything else. All types of people can be forgiven by trusting in Christ. The language Paul used here may seem harsh or even boastful, but it preserves an important distinction. Paul believed and taught the principle of mutual submission among believers. But the truth does not submit. Paul voluntarily came before the leaders in Jerusalem and calmly presented to them the message he was preaching. He was maintaining accountability and solidarity with other Christian leaders, without for a moment assuming that what Christ had given him was open to their approval. Paul discussed the gospel he was preaching among the Gentiles in a private meeting with the leaders of the church, probably James, Peter, and John. The meeting in privacy was not, as the Judaizers hoped to claim, for the purpose of correcting Paul's message. Instead, Paul met privately to make sure they were all in agreement, or his ministry would have been useless. If the apostles incorrectly agreed with him or agreed with the Judaizers, this would have caused severe damage to the work that Paul had already done for years among the Gentiles and hurt future missionary efforts. Paul realized the momentous importance of the decision that needed to be made regarding the relationship of Gentiles and Jews on the common meeting ground of Christianity. Paul had no doubts about the message Christ had given him. Paul had no doubts about the message that Christ had given him, but he appeared before the other apostles as an equal, expecting their wholehearted support. Verse 3, Paul's message preached among the Gentiles was tested in the treatment of the young Greek convert whom Paul brought with him along on the journey to Jerusalem, which was Titus. Paul's message to the Gentiles was that God accepted anyone who believes, regardless of race or religious background. Titus's presence gave the entire church an opportunity to practice what they preached. The gospel clearly applied to Titus without requiring his circumcision. The development was a major loss for the Judaizers, for it showed that the Jerusalem church had accepted Paul's policy. Circumcision was a big issue for the Jews because the custom dated back to the days of Abraham and their birth as a nation. More than any other practice, circumcision separated God's people from their pagan neighbors. In Abraham's day, this was essential for developing the pure worship of the one true God. Whether the Judaizers were intentionally trying to undermine Christianity with this requirement, or whether they sincerely believed that as an outgrowth of Judaism, Christianity should fulfill Jewish requirements, they were wrong. The apostles did not demand that Titus be circumcised, though he was a Gentile. They agreed with Paul that circumcision was an unnecessary rite for Gentile converts. Several years later, Paul did circumcise Timothy, another Greek Christian. Unlike Titus, however, Timothy was half Jewish. Paul did not deny Jews the right to be circumcised. He was simply saying that Gentiles should not be asked to become Jews before becoming Christians. Verse 4. Here Paul called the Judaizers so-called Christians false ones. They were most likely from the party of the Pharisees, the strictest religious leaders of Judaism. Some of these Judaizers came to spy on the believers. These people somehow were planted into the Christian ranks by the leadership of the Pharisees. If they got into the private meeting Paul had with the church leaders, someone of power may have been behind the controversy. The Pharisees would have been most interested in observing what was going on in the Christian camp, especially regarding freedom from Jewish regulations. Indeed, their very existence involved detailed obedience to Jewish law and traditions and making sure everyone else did the same. The philosophy of the Judaizers was something like, if you can't beat them or join them, then try to change them by absorbing them. The status quo of Judaism with Jesus repeatedly The status quo of Judaism, which Jesus repeatedly confronted during his ministry, did not give up easily. Those still committed to that system wanted to force the believers to follow all the Jewish regulations, to make themselves slaves under the religious legal system. Circumcision, with its inherent significance, was a good first step. Obviously, they did not see themselves as trying to enslave anyone, but Paul understood that this was the ultimate end of required obedience to all the Jewish laws and traditions. Verse 5. The truth of the good news was at stake. Paul sought to protect the truth that the gospel is for all people who can accept it by faith alone. Paul was convinced that circumcision, a rite he himself had undergone, was not part of the essential truth of the gospel. Paul fought to protect that gospel for you, specifically referring to the Galatian Christians to whom he wrote. But it also applies to any believer today who has not come out of a Jewish background. We have received salvation without having to ascribe to a whole set of Jewish laws because Paul had the foresight and wisdom to fight for protection of the gospel of grace regarding this issue. Verse 6. Paul's wording here was not meant disrespectfully toward the apostles and church leaders. Paul was walking a fine line between asserting his independence from the apostles and yet his unity with them. Paul was not in awe of the apostles who they were made no difference to him in in that sense. Paul wanted to make it clear that both his gospel and his apostleship were of supernatural origin. Because God has no favorites between him and the recognized apostles, then neither should anyone else. The apostles had nothing to add to what Paul was preaching. They did not correct Paul's message or try to add anything to it. Instead, they accepted Paul as an equal and accepted his message to the Gentiles as gospel truth. All right, so right now we're finding out that the old schoolers, if you want to call them that, they were doing whatever they could to try to keep people under that oppression of the law, and they really wanted to stifle the new teaching, the new the idea that you don't have to go through all of this to be circumcised. I mean, to be not circumcised, but you don't have to go through all of this to get salvation, and that circumcision meant little or nothing. It was just a right during the time of Abraham forward until Jesus came along, and so they thought that when Paul was meeting with the leadership, James, John, Peter, and all the other apostles that were still alive, that they would have denounced Paul, and they were hoping for that to happen. But they were like, oh no, well, he's teaching the same thing that we're teaching. He's preaching the same thing we're preaching. We don't have a problem with what he's saying. And the Judaizers, the Pharisees, and all those other people were like, no, wait a minute, this was not supposed to happen. All right, verses 7 and 8. What the apostles saw was most likely the convincing success that God had given to Paul's ministry of preaching the good news to the Gentiles. This is compared to Peter, who had been having a dynamic ministry of preaching to the Jews. Peter also had contact with the Gentiles, probably a key point in the approval of Paul and Barnabas' ministry. Peter's encounter with Cornelius had demonstrated God's acceptance of the Gentiles. This prepared Peter to accept the legitimacy of Paul's special call. Peter and Paul represented God's ongoing covenant with all of humanity under the saving grace made possible by Jesus. Each of them had valid ministries, ordained and authorized by Christ, because the same God was working through both men. Both Paul and Peter preached the same gospel. Though their audiences were vastly different, the message could not, and would not ever change. The gospel that remains unchanged today is that salvation is by God's grace alone for anyone who believes. Verse 9, the men mentioned here, James, half-brother of Jesus and leader of the Jerusalem church, and two of Jesus' original disciples and part of his inner circle of three, Peter and John. These three noted leaders accepted Paul and Barnabas as their co-workers, giving their blessing and encouragement in their ministry among the Gentiles. These pillars of the church had recognized the gift God had given to Paul. There was evidence of God's saving grace in Paul's own life and the results flowing from his ministry among the Gentiles. Paul was a walking, talking advertisement for the gospel. So Paul and Barnabas were encouraged to keep preaching to the Gentiles while the apostles in Jerusalem and Judea would continue their work with the Jews. This referred to each group's main focus. It was not exclusive. The apostles ministered to many Gentiles. Paul and his team always spoke to Jews as well. Yet always their message was the same, the gospel of salvation. Verse 10, although the ministry and message of Paul and Barnabas had been accepted, the entire issue had not been handled because the Judaizers had not been silenced. It would take the Council of Jerusalem to block the efforts to bring the gospel back under the law. In the meantime, much effort would be required to promote unity at the grassroots level between Jewish and Gentile Christians. The apostles realized that one immediate and practical way to bridge this possible gap would be to remember to help the poor. Paul assured them that he had been eager to do that. Paul never forgot this understanding. He continued to be eager to help the poor believers in Jerusalem. On his missionary journeys, Paul gathered funds to help the poor Jewish believers in Jerusalem. So this is quite a lesson, to show it kind of takes us to a place that we normally don't think of when we think about Paul and the things that took place in his life after his conversion. Let alone to think that there was 14 years of him preaching the gospel to the Gentiles before getting over to the original apostles and sitting down with them, and not being awestricken by them, but looking at them as equals and saying, hey, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We're all teaching and preaching the same thing, because all the work that we're doing would be for naught if it comes up that one of us is teaching something different than the other. And so when they found out that Paul was teaching the same message as they were and was anointed with the same gifts, they immediately were just like, hey, we're good. We're on the same page. So we're dealing with these Judaizers. The one thing that we're going to have to do is find a place to unify. And when in one of those things, we got to also remember together to always remember the poor. And so it's a really good lesson. Take time, go back, read the scriptures, listen to the commentary. There was some little parts in there where it was like bumpy road, but all in all, I hope that it gives you a better understanding. Pray and ask God to open your eyes and see if there's something that you've been missing in this all the time. And I thank you so much for your support and watching this video, and continue, as always, to keep studying. Keep studying. God bless you.